Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's session is titled Defining Disasters, How Rhetoric Shapes Our Understanding and Our Response to Hazards. My name is Andy Mink. I'm very pleased to be joining you tonight as the Vice President for Education Programs at the National Humanities Center. I had a chance to look through the roster of participants tonight, and I was really pleased to see such a wide spectrum of disciplines represented. We have a lot of humanities teachers, we have history folks, we have literature folks, but we also have a lot of folks on the STEM side of the aisle, environmental science teachers. We have folks who are working in different regions in the country, and it's always a pleasure for me to bring so many different perspectives to these conversations. I think they're richer because of that, and I think the interdisciplinary nature of what we're trying to offer only helps us gain an understanding and a knowledge that we can then share with our students. Of course, all of you, as I say almost every week, are also leaving the classroom today. You're either home, maybe just finished your dinner if you're on the East Coast or the Midwest. If you're out west, then you are likely still sitting in your classroom, or maybe your room is still warm with the bodies of the students that you taught today. We do appreciate very much that you've taken the time out of your busy schedules to join us. I welcome back all of our Los Angeles teachers. It seems like every session we have lots and lots of teachers from Southern California. I know last week when we had our webinar, you were on strike, and it looks like that's been resolved, and we're very pleased. We all send our support to you. And I know that it's often important to see that you have administrators with us as well. I see Dharma Hernandez's name with us, and I'm really pleased that she's able to join our work and see the ways that the National Humanities Center connects with teachers around the country. I'm joined tonight by Liz Skilton, who is the Assistant Professor of History at the University of Louisiana in Lafayette. There's Liz's website, so you can take a look at some of the work that she does, as well as have a heads up for a new title that's coming out in June of this year, Tempest Hurricane Naming and, I'm sorry, Liz, it's right behind my Go to Training Control panel, Naming in American Culture. Thank you. And I'm very pleased that Liz is able to bring her, what I think is a dual perspective on this topic, that is a humanities historian perspective of what essentially is a science-based and meteorological sort of conversation. But I think what we're going to find is that language matters, and the rhetoric helps us define what disasters are and how our culture responds to them. Tonight's webinar, while it's a conversation between Liz and myself, also includes all of you. So please make sure to go down to the chat box at the bottom of the Go to Training Control panel. Greet everybody, let us know where you're from, let us know how you're doing. But most importantly, during tonight's webinar, please register your thoughts and your questions and ideas that you might have in response to the content that we're sharing. We also have planned some open-ended questions and some poll questions during tonight's webinar. So be prepared to participate. And again, the webinar itself is all the better when you bring your expertise as an educator into what we do. The National Humanities Center is located in Durham, North Carolina, and for the last 41 years, we have pushed and advocated for the role of the humanities in the world that we live in. We do this through three primary missions. Our primary focus is a scholarly program, a fellowship program in which university professors from around the country, if selected, come and spend their year with us at the center. And they walk through those doors right in the middle of the building every single day, and they go to their studies and they do their work, their scholarship, their writing, their research that advances our understanding of their field. Oftentimes, this doesn't mean just understanding a topic better. It means having an appreciation for, an aesthetic for the process of doing that work as well. Our education work then builds bridges between the scholarly world and the world of the classroom. We do most of our work, I'd say, with K-12 classrooms, but we do an awful lot of work with community college classrooms, university classrooms, PhD students who are going to teach online education. And our goal is to really infuse all of our most interactive teaching pedagogies and what we believe in terms of student-led and inquiry-based teaching with good, solid scholarship and content. And then finally, we have a public-facing program in which we invite the public to also participate, whether that be in evening talks or conferences and institutes of various kinds. Our education department is committed to democratizing this work with a pretty deep repository of free and open resources. I'd invite you to take a look at our webpage at any point and get a sense of the examples that we have in terms of classroom-ready lessons, primary source collections and kits, and teacher serve essays, all of which have been contributed to and vetted by the scholars in our community. Our webinar series has proven to be one of the best ways to create ongoing real-time conversations between scholars and educators. I'm very pleased that our webinar series is popular. We generally reach our capacity in each session. We try to add new sessions as opportunities arise or topics seem to reveal as being an important one for that year. In fact, we've added 3 new titles since we released our registration at the beginning of the year. So I'd invite you to go back and take a look at any of those 3 and see what you might sign up for. If we have reached capacity, we put a little sold out button next to the description. Sometimes we reserve a space or 2 as VIP, or sometimes folks have conflicts come up. Imagine that, teachers with a busy schedule. And we do have some spaces open up. So if you ever see something that you really want to do and it's full, just email myself or Libby and we'll do our best to get you into that session. Each year at the center, we have a theme that we like to explore and really spend a lot of our focus on in these 3 different core missions. This year, our focus is the environmental humanities, and we're very interested in seeing ways in which scholars and educators can work together across that STEM humanities divide to better understand the relationship between human and physical landscapes. I think oftentimes we think that that divide is a large one, maybe as large as the person on your screen staring into this canyon. It's the canyon effect, Michelle. But really, I think there's a lot in common with the ways we approach these fields. We often point at storytelling as one of the most important ways. If you think of sciences and STEM as being fields that solve the problems that humans face, then the humanities can often describe why that's important and why we as citizens need to keep that in the front of our minds. So we really like to explore that. We're hosting a 3-day conference in April at the National Humanities Center in North Carolina. If you're nearby or if you just have a real interest in this topic, I'd invite you to join us. We're going to be capping our attendance somewhere around 150, and we'll have 2 full days of experiential workshops, seminars, and conversations in which we really look at the environmental humanities. There are other ways to get free content from the center. We have a podcast series that you're more than welcome to listen to or to share with your students. Oftentimes, this focuses on the process of thinking in and doing a humanities discipline. And we have a growing set of online courses that are open and available to educators across the country. Currently, we have 2 sessions that are live. We have a course in digital literacy in the classroom that is currently full for our spring sessions. We have a few slots remaining for an economic and history course called Suckers and Swindlers in American History. Please go to the website at the URL on your screen. And if you're interested in exploring the primary sources of the 20th century to better understand the role of fraud in American capitalism, I'd encourage you to sign up for that, and we'd love to have you. All of the work that I'm describing, we really hope is relevant and connected to the classroom. And one of the ways we do that is by asking our annual Teacher Advisory Council to participate and contribute and evaluate the work that we do. I cannot thank this group more, these 15 educators more, for the work that they do with us. It's regular, it's spontaneous often, and it's always very, very valuable for us to hear their opinions, to get their feedback on the ways that we intend to reach classrooms. After tonight's session, you'll be asked to complete a survey, and when you've done so, you will be able to download your certificate. You can take that certificate and you can turn it into your central office or administration, add it to your teacher portfolio, or you can go to our website and you can download that PDF. It's in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. And what we've done is add all of the webinars and all of the work that we do to one single sheet. And so if you get this either pre-approved or you take it in sort of as a bundle rather than individual sheets of paper and certificates, that might help each of you. I would encourage you, by the way, if you're in a district or a division or a school that has other ways that this kind of work might help you in your professional growth and we have not articulated it correctly, please reach out to me or Libby and we'll be sure to change that. I'll give you one quick example. A friend and a colleague here in North Carolina on the eastern end of the state noticed that I guess it's the technology requirement that he has in his school district is often satisfied by attending webinars like this one. So we were able to add that for Lee, and he could take it to his principal or his administrator. If any of you see some crossover that we're not aware of, please reach out and let us know how we can help. So all that's a framing for tonight's introduction. I'm getting ready to bring Liz to the microphone and share the stage with her. Liz, if you give me just a second, I'm going to unmute you and give you there you are. Liz, if you can go ahead and activate your microphone. Thank you. And Liz, I'm also going to give you the mouse. Hey, Liz, can you hear me in Louisiana?
Yes, I can.
Fantastic. So Liz, before I really turn this over to you, I do need to say that, as somebody who grew up on the coast, I grew up in the Virginia Beach Tidewater area. Natural disasters were always a part of our cycle, right? Every summer we worried about hurricanes. It was always on our minds. My mother's sister, part of my family, lived in Miami in the early 90s. And I distinctly remember, I was probably just out of college, distinctly remember having to go to South Florida, go to Miami. At the time, it was Dade County, after Hurricane Andrew, ironically, and help them clean up. And, as we walk through this part of Coral Gables, I think it was, and houses are stripped down to their cinder block foundations. What I remember most vividly, and the thing that really kind of struck me, was cleaning up I don't even know if we cleaned it up, watching the open boxes of family photographs just floating by in rivers of detritus, and just knowing that they were completely gone forever. And I remember a lot of folks at the time didn't really have a language for that. We didn't know how to describe it. People were sort of speechless, and I mean that in a very literal kind of way. So I'm really interested in the way that you're going to offer language and rhetoric and sort of our understanding of these events. And I'm also interested how you got started in this.
Oh, well, I'm sitting over here nodding because it's a story that is very familiar to anybody who studies disaster or even in some way comes in contact with a disaster. I got started looking into disaster history and particular disasters through a program called National History Day years and years and years ago. So I'd done several different papers for the program as part of my school projects, and then kind of left it during college and came back to it in grad school when I moved to New Orleans to study history at Tulane University. So in some ways, I guess I look at it and it makes sense why I would gravitate towards that. And in other ways, it seems completely new to me. And obviously, how you study history as a high school student or a middle school student is incredibly different than how you study it at the graduate level and then afterwards. I can see somebody else participates in National History Day. Yes. So I'm a proponent of the program.
Liz, National History Day just tweeted that out. What an amazing testimony. And I can tell you that many of our participants are advocates for and sponsors that as well. So thanks for mentioning that. But
absolutely.
But tell us more about your work. I'm anxious to hear more about this.
Yeah, definitely. So my research and teaching specialize in the history of disaster, particularly in the Gulf South region of the United States. I teach courses on this subject, like my American Disaster Seminar, as well as others on environmental history and gender history, which seems like an odd fit until you think about the fact that disasters affect men and women very differently. And so that is how I approach this disaster history. I look specifically at hurricanes, floods, and mass shooting incidents because those are the things that most affect where I live in Lafayette, Louisiana. However, in doing work on other grants, I do research on all different types of disasters. And a lot of that is public history related projects and working with the communities. Above all else, though, my goal is to provide people an understanding of how to look at disaster and the ways that it influences their lives in their decisions made before an event, during, and after a crisis. I also believe that the language we use to describe disaster informs our futures as well as our past. And I'm excited to talk to you tonight about how to incorporate what constitutes a disaster, how we've defined it historically, and then how we go about defining it today in your own classrooms.
Excellent, thank you. So you should be able to advance the slides. Liz, and I'm going to moderate the questions and sort of bring certain things in, but you're running the show now.
Okay, great. So in thinking about the structure for this webinar and how to maximize people's experience, because I know you're coming from all different backgrounds, and in hearing what you're doing and seeing the feed on where you're at, I'm really excited to talk tonight about different disasters and how they influence our lives. So to do that, I wanted to start out with a survey of your knowledge about disaster. So with the help of the National Humanities team, I've designed a brief survey to gauge your understanding of disaster. And so I'm going to go ahead and advance it forward.
Okay,
so we're going to launch the survey.
So I think we're going to do this together.
Okay.
I think, and hopefully this will work and won't be a disaster, lowercase. So Liz, the first question, the open-ended question, I think that's one you're just going to ask, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay, so for our participants, just to frame this, Liz is going to pose an open-ended question, and what we'd like you to do is type into the chat box. Again, that's found at the bottom of the Go to Training control panel. We'd like you to chat your answer, and so text it in longhand. I would encourage you to maybe put all of your thought in one line before you hit enter. Otherwise, it'll get divided up and people will start to splice together. But Liz, you're going to ask the question now, and we're going to wait just a few moments for folks to respond.
I'm really excited to see what you all respond. The question is, how do you define a disaster? Oh, and I see one answer already pop up.
Susan was
they were ready.
That's right. So how do you define a disaster? Okay, now it's going to start. Thanks, Susan. Disaster is an event that has devastating, far-reaching impact, life-changing event, something you struggle to overcome. Brennan, I'm glad you're back with us. There's Ginger in Colorado. They're going to start flying, Liz, so you have to keep track.
Yeah, I'm watching. Event that's life-changing, a large-scale event, chaotic, with repercussions, unexpected, natural and human-made.
Yep, that unexpectedly seems to come up a lot. So it's a surprise, it's unanticipated, a negative life-changing event.
Traumatic, chaotic, mass destruction.
Gosh, I see Juliet. There's
apocalyptic literature, yeah.
Nobody's mentioned zombies yet.
Comes up every time I teach the course.
It always does.
Yeah.
Event that brings about damage or destruction. Great.
Oh, there we go. Thank you, Frank.
Thanks, Frank.
Chaos, confused, lost. Oh, those are some interesting descriptions.
I'll save this chat box for you so you can mine these later.
Yeah, that's great.
Dharma. Disaster is that dramatically upsets the balance of life or environment. Excellent answer, Dharma. A serious disruption. Okay. All right. It seems like you got a lot to work with there.
Yeah, absolutely. And ending on Jeremiah's natural or man-made life-changing event pretty well sums up a little bit of everything in there, as well as the creating havoc. So we're going to move on to the next question, which I believe is a select-based question. So you're going to select an answer.
So for everybody in the room, I'm about to open a poll, and that poll is going to pop up in your screen. And there's actually going to be two different screens for this poll. So don't take them as one after the other. We'll answer the polls one at a time. We're going to give everybody I'll give the room about 20 seconds to respond. It's simply a checkbox and then submit. So here comes the first poll.
So which types of disasters have you experienced? And you can select one or more of the following. So this would be a hurricane or tropical storm, a flood, a tornado, an earthquake, a wildfire.
Gosh, our folks in California, just immediately, thanks, Joshua, that is hard. Earthquake, folks remember the '88 World Series in Southern California. So I'm going to let it keep going just a little bit more, maybe about a minute total. Half of you have voted so far, so please register your thoughts. What disasters have you experienced? I think I see the skewer of our geography in this. Okay. And 5 more seconds, please. Register your answer. 5 more seconds. And I'm going to close the poll. So when I close that, do you see the responses, Liz?
I do not.
You look over in the Go to Training Control panel. I see it. I don't know that you do. Look under polls and tests. Does it show you what the percentage is?
Where is that? I'm sorry, guys. I'm trying to find it.
I'll tell you what, let me read this to you.
Okay.
So here's the responses. 54% of our attendees voted, and the answers are in this order. Number 1, earthquake, 75%.
Okay.
Number 2, flood at 28%. Number 3, hurricane or tropical storm at 25%. Wildfire at 24%, and tornado at 10%.
All right.
You got that?
I do.
Okay, let's go to the next poll. Or do you want to comment on that before I open up the next one?
No, let's open up the next one and then we'll do all of them together.
Okay. All right, folks, here comes the next poll. It's going to work in the same way. Are you ready? Here we go.
So again, you're answering to the question, which type of disaster have you experienced? And so you'll select one or more of the following. This includes a shooting incident, a landslide or a mudslide, a pandemic or emergency disease, a sinkhole or quicksand, and a volcanic eruption. Oh, and I see somebody commented blizzards, but I'm sorry, I don't have that on the list. So I see your vote, though. I will write it down.
It's a little startling that there's so many to choose. We couldn't put all of the disasters in our poll.
No, it was hard choosing 5.
Melissa, fortunately, has said 0. We did work with a teacher last year at the center and our teacher advisory council who was at the base of the volcano eruption in Hawaii. Right now we have 6% at volcanic eruption. Thankfully, Amanda has none. Oberndorfer, what if you're touched by it but not part of the event directly yourself? I think that part of the interpretation is how you might have experienced it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So pandemic or emergency disease, like the H1N1 scare, something like that. But you would have had to have been immediately affected by it.
So I suspect we're going to get fewer percentage voting, Liz, simply because many people are saying that none of them have happened. So they're not. We don't have a none of the above click.
That's okay.
Yeah, that's okay. Okay, 5 more seconds, please. And I'm going to close the poll. Okay, here are the results. Liz, with 28% of our attendees voting, we have 53% have experienced a shooting, 31% a landslide or a mudslide, 17% pandemic or emergency disease, 6% sinkhole, and 6% volcano.
Okay.
All right.
Well, in looking at all of those, I think it's pretty evident, geographically speaking, where everybody is tonight.
It is interesting how you can map that, right?
And it's also surprising in some ways, which types of disasters affect us. And I think in one way to move on from this is to kind of keep this in mind as we go through the rest of the discussion tonight, in that earthquakes ranked at the absolute highest on the first list and shooting on the second list. Besides that, I would say that the majority of us voted in that first list. We've had the most experience with, say, earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, wildfires, and tornadoes. I think it's great that a majority of you had said that you didn't have experience with that second list. But it's really interesting to see which of you experienced some of those on that second list and what they are. And it also speaks to where you work, right, in terms of your exposure and also where you live. So moving on to the next question, I believe that this one is a poll as well.
That's right. So one more poll question, please. Here it comes, folks.
So the question is, which disaster sayings are you familiar with? You can select one or more of the following. So stop, drop, and roll, which could also include shake, rattle, and roll, or drop, cover, and hold on. Turn around, don't drown. Duck and cover, and run, hide, fight.
I suspect that this will be different if you compare teachers to the general population too, simply because where educators are trained so much to and have to go through these kinds of drills with their kids. There's duck
Yeah,
and cover.
absolutely. And I see someone mentioning the Great Shakeout. We just did that in my class this semester, even though we don't have the earthquakes per se in Louisiana the same way that other areas of the country do. And I see shooting drills more common in schools now.
More common.
Lockdown drills.
Monthly drills at George's school. Wow. George, where are you from? San Bernardino, yeah.
Ah,
Okay, folks, about 10 more seconds, please. 10 more seconds.
oh, the Alice training. Yes.
And I'm going to close the poll. And so
Okay. I'm
here are
really
the
excited to see what you say on this one.
results here. 94% of our attendees recognize stop, drop, and roll or some variation. 80% recognize duck and cover. 34% recognize run, hide, or fight. And 17% turn around, don't drown.
Okay, that's great. So as you can see right here, just in this poll and then also in our discussion of disasters you've experienced, we have a variety of different terminology, sayings, and images that come to mind when we think about what constitutes a disaster and how we should respond to it. I think those disaster sayings are key in looking at that. So we're all very familiar with the stop, drop, and roll. It could mean multiple things. It could mean you yourself are on fire, right? Which is how I was taught it. Or it could mean in response to something like an earthquake, right? The lock and hold on, or the cover and hold on. The other one that plays up there in terms of the numbers is the duck and cover. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about why that is later on tonight. And then the last one, the run, hide, and fight, is probably the ones you use the most in your schools, because that's what we are experiencing, and that's what we are at fear from at this particular moment. So I think it's interesting that it ranks with the 1, 2, 3. That's not how I thought it would rank, so I'm surprised by that, but it's great. So surveying the crowd just within this chat room, we can see how our experience are both shared in some ways and diverge in others. We can also see, here, let me see if I can get it. Oh, there we go. Okay. We can also see just how prevalent disasters are in our lives. We use a lot of different terminology to describe it, some of which you had already put in the text box here. So I think it's interesting. You can probably find your own somewhere in here, or other phrases that you use. And it's estimated that an American will actually experience a major disaster about 4 different times throughout their lives. So it might happen all back to back. It might happen spaced out periodically. But I think these answers really prove that to be true. You all have experienced a disaster at some point in time, and I'm sure that it brings certain memories to your head immediately. Just looking at the statistics for the last 2 years, it's surprising how much disasters affect our lives. In 2017, disasters caused by natural hazards, for example, affected about 8% of the US population, or approximately 25 million Americans. It was the costliest year on record in terms of disaster damage, with $16 billion disasters costing the US approximately $300 billion in damages. Americans were also grossly affected in this last year, 2018, to the tune of about $155 billion in damages. Now, those in California, you know that this number is still rolling in. I mean, we have a tally for 2018, but in many ways, you are still in the period of recovery. So whether that number will change in the future, we'll just have to wait and find out. And I'm thinking about you as you're there. So if this is the case, that Americans experience disaster intimately and that it really affects us frequently, why don't we teach it more in schools? You may do the disaster drills in school, you may talk about the sayings, you might have to do the prep once a month. I saw somebody do there. I remember doing it once a semester maybe, including the exiting the school bus quickly, which was always a fun drama to do. But in general, why isn't it more, or why isn't it part of our curriculum more? I think part of what happens is that it's hard to figure out where to insert it in your curriculum. In many ways, disasters are about history, but they're also about science, they're about humanities in general, they're very interdisciplinary. So it's hard to figure out how to put it in with your other material. But what I will say is, from a disaster historian perspective or a disaster humanities perspective, you're probably already teaching this, and you just either are not knowing that you're teaching it, or you have this opportunity to really expand on the subject. So what I want to do tonight is to help you figure out how to incorporate it more into your classrooms, because it is something that affects us intimately, and it will affect your students throughout the course of their lives. So I think it's really critical to include as part of our classroom discussions. And this is what I found from my teaching experience in particular. So to start things off, I want to back up and start to define what a disaster is. When we talk about defining a disaster, we have to talk about the different terminology that we use with it. And I want to point out that there are stark differences between what we considered a hazard and a disaster. However, we often blur them together when we're talking about them. And in doing so, we create this perception that the disaster and hazard are together. And it might be more helpful to split them apart. So looking at the definition of what a disaster is, this just comes from the regular dictionary. So a disaster is a sudden event, such as an accident or natural catastrophe that causes great damage and loss of life. So you'll notice a lot of you had said that when you defined it. Congratulations, bonus points for you, got that right. Meanwhile, a hazard is a danger or a risk. It is the potential source of danger. When we look at a disaster and a hazard together, you can kind of see them as a cause and effect. Your hazard is the cause, it's the hurricane, it's the flood itself, and your disaster is what comes after. It's the tying together of the hazard and the people that are living in this situation. In many ways, disasters are not natural, but hazards are. So like I said, the hazard is your hurricane, your flood. That is a natural thing, right? You can argue with a little bit of the variation with it, but in classifying it, your hazard is going to be the natural side of it. Whereas your disaster is everything that goes into it. And as a result, we often hear this phrase, there are no such thing as a natural disaster. It was popularized particularly post-Katrina, and it's something that you'll hear thrown around in the media quite a bit. That's what it means. It just means that disasters are a combination of various things coming together, whereas your hazard is your cause. It's the thing that instigated it. When we look at a historical definition of a disaster, thinking about a disaster and the hazards that impact the disaster's creation, it's important to realize that disasters are the total effect of both hazards and people, because disasters in many ways are about people, affecting people, caused by people, either through inaction or their response or their location to hazards. And most importantly, disasters are solved or mitigated by people. So meaning that we work to try and prevent them from happening. So I'm going to do a little test here through the text box again to see if you got these concepts down, because they are kind of important moving forward. So in the text box, it's really simple. Tell me whether a hurricane on its own is a hazard or a disaster. All right, Amelia got it. It is a hazard. All right, so tell me about whether a hurricane's aftermath is a hazard or a disaster. We're thinking about everything coming together. Good job, guys. All right. So we're going to move on. Here's your second one. Are you ready? So what about a wildfire?
Ulysses says disaster. Jason does not quite sure. Both.
All right, so we got a lot of not sures on this one. So hurricane's pretty clear cut, right? You can see it out there, it's coming at you, that's the hazard. The wildfire, I mean, there are elements to it that could be considered both disaster and hazard, right? So you could quantify them as both. Or define them as simply one or the other. Now, I know a lot of you, as you're responding, are thinking to yourself as we go through this right now, this is very much a tree falls in the forest kind of situation. So if the tree falls in the forest, or in our case, a major incident occurs in the forest and no one is there to observe it, is it still a disaster? Well, simply answered, not really. Mainly because we, as humans, are the ones who get to label it a disaster. The tree falling is a result of the hazard, but is only defined as a disaster if we say it is so. Oh, I see the Alice train there. That's great. All right, so this question of who gets to and how we define a disaster is one that's central to the narrative of American history. Disasters play a critical role in the formation and construction of American identities, power relations, economic systems, and environmental practices. Thus, disasters provide us insight into American beliefs and behaviors because they reflect periods in which they occur. We usually talk about disasters in terms of a couple different variables, in terms of size or scale of the hazard that instigated them. So this includes distinguishing between, say, a Category 5 storm versus a Category 1 storm, the range of impact of the disastrous event caused by the incident. So did it affect the whole community or just some? Which also leads us to talk about the mortality factor of the event. So how many people died or were injured by it? And then we also measure the resulting impact of the disaster. We measure this through changes in policies, communities, or the nation more broadly, including the social, economic, and political changes that come after an incident has occurred. And finally, we discuss the overall influence or significance of its comparison to similar events in history. This is where you usually hear that phrase, it was the worst catastrophe, it was worse than the storm before it. That's part of our efforts to kind of contextualize it amongst other disasters. This measurement of the continued influence is key to forming our impressions of the next incidents. For example, rhetoric like it was never to be repeated is often grossly misleading, but it is frequently used to stress the importance of an event in the moment. All right.
Liz,
go ahead.
I'm sorry. Can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
I don't want to get ahead of you if you're going to cover this later, so feel free to pin me to the side. But I was curious when you sort of set that up in terms of the American culture and identity. Is it your sense then that other countries don't have the same relationship with disasters?
You know, I don't feel comfortable speaking to every country. I can tell you that when we look at the Caribbean, for instance, their perception of what constitutes a major storm is very different than ours. Their ideas about how they fund the disaster relief, for instance, it comes from different European beliefs. And so in some ways that influences how they define their disasters as well, and what they consider a regular response or an extreme response to them. That's just like one example. I'm sure you could look at the specifics of it for all different countries. And there is a really rich disaster history literature that is out there. If you just type it into Twitter or the internet, it'll pop right up. So there are a lot of people writing on this because it does affect us so intimately.
Right, and so that makes a lot of sense, particularly if your perspective or the way that we're trying to understand this topic is through language and rhetoric and expression.
Okay, yeah, absolutely.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
So, all right. In terms of continuing to define disasters, I also want to point out that we usually break disasters into what we consider 3 different categories. So, and by we, I mean scholars in this case. And we use these different categories to kind of describe them overall. So the first type of disaster described by scholars is what's called a rapid onset disaster. These include disasters with clear beginnings like a volcanic eruption or a fire. And then there are disasters that take a little while to develop. And those we categorize as what you would call a slow onset disaster. These might include economic recessions or depressions. And then there is this final group, which is slightly newer, which we call a cascading disaster. These are disasters that could have been rapid onset or slow onset in the beginning, and are often multiple disasters combined. The big thing to remember about cascading disasters is that there are usually 2 or more incidents that result from one another or build or cascade into a greater combined disaster. Or they are separate incidents that become related over time, leading to a larger disaster overall. A great example of a cascading disaster is a wildfire that is subsequently followed by a flood. The damage caused by the wildfire accentuates or accelerates the impact of the excessive rainfall following the fire, resulting in a flood of water and debris, sometimes mudslides or landslides in the end. Both could be considered their own disasters, so the wildfire and the flood, but are linked to either by the time frame or population affected. While there are many disasters that we could talk about in this webinar, I've decided to focus on 5 examples today that I think illustrate fundamental moments when disasters and their definitions shaped American history. And I see someone tsunami and following earthquake. Yes, absolutely. That would be one that you could split in that case of a cascading. So for the 5 that we're going to talk about tonight, you probably already know what they are because you looked at the readings. So it's the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, the Great Depression, the environmental movement, the 1992 Los Angeles riots, and Hurricane Katrina. So as you'll see here, they represent a variety of rapid onset, slow onset, and cascading disaster examples. And they also fit nicely with requirements for the thematic coverage of that advanced placement US history exam, the current theme of National History Day, which is triumph and tragedy, and will most likely be on a college exam at some point for your students in the future. Overall, they also cover a wide variety of disasters your students will experience: fires, depressions or recessions, environmental concerns, riots or social incidents, and a complex disaster. I'd also like to point out that you yourself have expressed that you have experienced events like this. Some of you had mentioned fire as part of your experience for those in the California area. We all have experienced a recession, not necessarily a depression to the scale of the Great Depression, but we have experienced that recession. And we also still experience things like concerns over the environment, social disasters are caused by social factors, and complex disasters. So I hope that they'll be interesting to kind of follow along tonight. All right. So beginning with the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. On March 25th, 1911, A fire broke out in a shirtwaist factory in New York City. As the flames snarled to smoke by the end of the day, the death count stood at 146, including 126 women aged 14 to 23 and 23 men. With a horrifying mortality rate, New Yorkers reviewed the information pouring in from sources at the site. The 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the building had been locked at their doors to prevent workers from leaving midday. Garment workers on these floors, a majority young women who were part of the laboring class at this turn of the century, had burned alive trying to escape from the flames, a horrifying loss in an era focused on progress. In many ways, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire mimicked other incidents reported at the time. Coal mining disasters, steamliner wrecks, floods caused by levee or dam building without regulation, and injuries while on dangerous job sites plagued individuals from childhood to adulthood. In a world of unregulated or minimally regulated labor safety practices, the fire illustrated the workers' best interest was the least of concern to employers or the government. However, despite the disaster rationalization rhetoric that had existed before this, favoring business development for the sake of progress over individual concern or harm, a new wave of interest in the impact of non-regulation was on the rise. In fact, a whole insurance industry had sprung up around the marketing of perceived risk to life within this progressive era, proposing that Americans should expect a level of catastrophe in their everyday lives, and they should invest in insurance, aka life insurance, guaranteed to provide for certain liabilities that they would experience. In 3 reasons, why was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire important to American disaster history? First, it illustrated a larger shift in the understanding of disaster as solely an act of God, to one that it could be caused by man as well. A disaster like this fire was not caused by an all-powerful God seeking vengeance on the wicked, as was rationalized in the American past. No, this fire took place in an era of scientific inquiry, understanding, and technological development. This fire was caused clearly by hazards like the inadequate fire prevention techniques, hazardous labor conditions, and greed. When we look at the rhetoric from this incident, I'm going to change the slide here. Through newspaper articles in particular, we can see this change in understanding of a cause of disaster occurring in the description of who is at fault for the incident. So in this one, it says 142 die when shirtwaist factory burns. Girl employees leap to their deaths from windows. Meanwhile, in the second one, we can see a shift here. It's a couple of days later. It says criminal action to follow fire horror. And then as they go through the details here, we can see that they're starting to unpack who specifically is responsible for this disaster. In reviewing the terminology and descriptions of the incident of the fire, the Triangle Shirtwaist Company's liability and the resulting concerns about all New York City business safety practices following in newspaper accounts is a great activity to do with students. You can sit there and have them unpack and look for these various definitions, highlight who is responsible, and track how this idea of who is responsible changes as more details about the event come out. In addition, you can take a look at who is considered the victim in this case, and whether that changes the status or impression of who is responsible. In addition, you can track the development of different groups to promote ideas about fire safety legislation, working standards, and the creation of various women's organizations that blend those concerns over work conditions with this emerging push for women's participation in society, like the International Ladies Garment Union, which is going to come out of this as well. The other thing I usually do with students is I have them break down who they think is responsible for this as part of a trial. Using those newspapers I talked about, I split the class up into 2 different groups. as well as statements from the trial. You can usually pull those offline pretty easily. And I have them argue the point. So they will have had the lecture kind of building out whether they're at fault, how they go about talking about this as a disaster and defining it as a disaster in this new era where you have insurance coming into play and liability as a question. Those are all things you can do with the students. And it works really well. They get really into it. I also link this topic to other topics in US history. My favorite thing to link is the women and child labor regulations that are going to come about nationwide. So much like I saw somebody talking about the jungle over here by Upton Sinclair, that's a perfect link into this situation and talking about the working conditions and the living conditions of those at this time. I also bring in Louis Hine and his pictures in particular. In Louisiana and Mississippi, he went through and he looked at the oyster and shrimping industry. So you see two different pictures there. The girl at the top, she's shucking an oyster. And the boy at the bottom, he's standing on a bunch of different shells from oyster. And the most common injury was a slice to the middle of the hand, for instance, because that sharp knife would go through the oyster to get it open. But I use this as a way to talk about the hazards of being on the job site. And I connect it to this larger disaster history where we're kind of defining who's at fault, what sort of regulation we should have, and how we go about helping people. And you can link the jungle in with that as well. Overall, when we look at the impact of this particular disaster, the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire, we can see it simply by reviewing the major laws and policies that were passed following the incident. So this is going to include the list that you see here. The efforts by activists to push for this policy and influencing later policies regarding hazards and labor conditions, as well as an ethos that pushed progressive era change forward in other areas of American lives, is a really important lesson to teach them. And it helps build the basis for what I'm going to talk about next. Overall, the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire shifted our impression of disaster in its review of the impact of policy and regulation on hazard mitigation. It also influenced a generational belief that disasters should be regulated or prevented at both the local and federal level. And this would influence the next series of events, which is going to be the Great Depression.
Liz, before you move on, and part of my job tonight is to keep us on time, so I don't want to get too far down this, but you mentioned insurance for a moment as a 20th century concept. It sounds like you're suggesting that the insurance industry has a whole lot to do with this rhetoric of disaster and hazard and the way that it impacted American life.
Absolutely. So if we look at, say, the 1800s, we can see the development of different types of insurances for businesses and crops and fluctuations with those enterprises. And by the time we get to the 20th century, we start to see this shift in the attempt to label lives as something that could be insurable. And there's a brand new book on the development of the insurance industry and related to weather by Jamie Petruska that I highly recommend. But she argues that people went from kind of getting assurances over their crops to trying to predict whether weather was going to influence their lives. So if a great storm hit your house, could you get insurance for your house? And so it's part of this whole trajectory of trying to plan for the worst. And it's going to start with this concept of life insurance at the start of the 20th century, and it will build towards what we would consider that flood insurance or fire insurance policies a little bit later on. So we can really see this with the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire, but we're going to see this with other disasters that we talk about a little bit later on. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you so much.
Okay. So moving on to the Great Depression, and I hope that I am on time, so you can tell me if I'm going over here.
So it's 10 minutes of 8 now, so we've got about 40 minutes.
40 minutes, okay, we got this. All right, so from the get-go, the Great Depression had to be created in the public's mind as a disaster, as much as it was experienced. It was not a regular economic recession. It was not born simply from one experience or another. It was a combination of crises that resulted from hazards that were both natural and human imposed or anthropogenically imposed. The nation had never experienced an event of this magnitude, and thus it merited a different type of response. Or these were the terms as outlined by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt when he laid out his first New Deal and then reinforced it as he explained his second New Deal. In fact, if looking at this series of truly misfortunate events, we could see how this crisis could be explained as irregular, to say the least. So we've got a stock market crash and resulting depression, the 1927 and 1935 floods. 27 is the one we tend to talk about the most, and there's a lot of literature for those that are teaching literature classes that you can bring in with the 27 flood. You've got the extreme drought and soil exhaustion conditions leading towards what we know as the Dust Bowl. The overproduction of crops leading with that, deforestation and development, the farming crisis, pest infestation. My favorite is to talk about the boll weevil, although you could definitely talk about the grasshopper too. The post-Civil War inequalities regarding different positions or stations in life that lead to this sharecropping system and obviously lead towards an economic depression affecting people very intimately. And then obviously another cause in here that most people do not link is the World War I global economic impact. So we have outside pressures that are playing a role in this as well. So all of these are coming together at this particular moment in time to create this Great Depression, or this is what is laid out by Roosevelt when he talks about it. And I believe that one of the sources was Roosevelt's introduction to the New Deal and why it should exist. As Roosevelt is trying to figure out how to present this Great Depression, and lots of people are working with him on this and going back and forth and kind of creating the rhetoric for defining the Great Depression. He needed to present it as this ultimate disaster. It was an extreme response to multiple events. And in many ways, he also had to clarify that a depression could fit in with what we would consider those natural causes. And thus, he's kind of justifying that this man-influenced or man-caused event was part of a larger event by lumping several catastrophes together. In many ways, it was easy for him to do this in that the conditions were so dire. We have lots of discussion about those conditions. And in other ways, it was not, because it did take some serious convincing to connect all of these events together and to call them one thing. When you think about it, I mean, it's not something that just comes out of thin air. We are creating the impression that this is worse than any other incident we had ever faced, and that it was a combination of all of these incidents combined and not just one. One of the ways that we see Roosevelt and others in administration try and do this is by creating associated imagery made to present the event as a disaster. So this includes the creation of two very stereotypical images of Great Depression victims. So the first being the forgotten man, who is stripped from his society, excised from his home to live a life as a grifter or an outsider. He's neither welcome or excluded as he stands in line for a meal. He could be a veteran. He could be a builder of progressive era skyscrapers. He could be an unemployed nobody. He was faceless in many ways. He was forgotten. The other corollary image is the migrant mother, which is one you're probably very familiar with and that you teach in your classes. When we look at the migrant mother as a disaster victim, we can see those stereotypical images of disaster painted on her face. She's weary, she's burdened by motherhood and hardships. She's downtrodden and caked in dirt and dust, and she has obviously experienced something traumatic, which I believe is something that somebody had mentioned in their description of a disaster. Her face is empty and yet soulful, and her eyes are hollowed and protruding ominously from her face. She herself could be the migrant farmer's wife, a destitute former factory worker, or somebody nameless that you just saw walking by. Both of these images of the forgotten man and the migrant mother become the faces of the Depression's memorable scar on American life. They are unforgettable, and that was the point. They had names, but yet they didn't. They could reflect an entire generation, but yet they didn't. Their names and faces appeared in films, images, cartoons, songs, and otherwise, but most importantly, they helped form this impression of the Great Depression as a national crisis that had very clear victims. These victims, like others with disastrous circumstances, needed federal assistance, not charity. And Roosevelt argued that it was the government's responsibility to step in and provide this when the entire country was suffering. So they don't have those local resources that can assist them the same way that regular disasters can. And so in this cartoon right here, you can see FDR shaking hands with the forgotten man. And then obviously King Cotton over here. And in the West, beating off the fires that would spring from the dried land. All of these images play a role in shaping this impression of the disaster that is the Great Depression. When we look at FDR's policies that he will introduce as part of the New Deal and what becomes the second New Deal, we can see that they are drastically different from the previous president, Herbert Hoover's policies regarding how to deal with the Great Depression. FDR's policies targeted relief on multiple forms. In fact, they called it relief. And in that way, we get this terminology associated with the disaster coming into play here again. When we look at the different things that he does, I want you to pay attention to the words that you see that relate to disaster and put them in the text box. So I'm going to read them off. We've got the Emergency Banking Act, Federal Emergency Relief Act, Public Works Administration, Civilian Conservation Corps, Tennessee Valley Authority, Works Progress Administration, National Recovery Act, Agricultural Adjustment Act, Homeowners Loan Corporation, Federal Housing Administration, Agricultural Adjustment Act, Glass-Steagall Banking Act, Securities Exchange Act, Social Security Act, National Labor Regulations Act, and Fair Labor Standards Act. So I didn't see anybody put it in there. If we look just at these words, we see emergency stick out multiple times, recovery stick out other times. We see standards. Oh, there we go. I'm seeing it. Yeah, security is another one that comes up. And we can see it in the idea of relief, as somebody had said there. So we've got this idea that it is an emergency, we need immediate relief, and that we need long-term recovery, which is also part of the use of that language to express it as a disaster. While the trend in disaster management by the federal government was on the upswing by 1929, FDR's plans were revolutionary. They were quick, there were many of them, and they bypassed many of the traditional perspectives on federal intervention, which favored that state and local or charity relief systems. So I give you a good example, the 1900 Galveston storm. We see the creation of the Red Cross and kind of the emergence of them with this storm as an entity that's part of those charity organizations and the belief that that disaster relief should happen at that local level. So when we look at the New Deal as a recovery element, we can just see how unique it is to have the federal government step in every walk of life, basically, and make an intervention to fix what they consider to be a disaster. As a result of this, it is possible to debate the merits of FDR's reach through the adoption of these policies. And I imagine that that's what some of you do in your classrooms as you take a look at this and you say, is he stretching? What I recommend for a class activity with this in particular is to do just that, to split your classroom into small groups, assign them a different set of policies to examine, and then to formulate an argument for why or why not this policy might be seen as an overreach. Then they should present this argument to the class for a vote. What it does is it allows them to work through each of these different acts. They become really familiar with it and they will remember it by the time they get to a test. In looking at the acts itself, you've got a document source activity where they're really examining what what the precedent was that's set up for this act in the future, and whether it is an overreach based on what their perception of it is. I was really floored by the word relief. Yeah, absolutely. Welfare and handouts. So the language has changed dramatically. Absolutely. For those that are teaching students of a younger age, this activity is particularly for you. So I recommend a study of those different policies that we had looked at just before, also by group. But instead of going through verbatim what they meant, maybe break down for them what they meant. And then have them compare these policies to images of the Great Depression that were collected by Yale University's photogrammer database. And this database includes something like 90,000 images from the Great Depression that are available. So you can see the little dots there. That means you can zoom in on the location and take a look at photographs that were taken in your specific area of the country during the Great Depression. What you do with those photographs is you have them analyze the different themes, the presentation of the photograph, and the crisis as represented in the imagery there. So how did your region experience the Great Depression? Which disasters were a factor in influencing their lives in the region? And which of FDR's policies would have addressed that crisis represented within? So are you able to connect those policies that you've just gone through to the images coming out of the area? If you want to take it a step further, you can have them do some newspaper research and actually see whether they're talking about it. But start simple for those at a younger age. And this is really interactive because they can actually see the people and the sites, and you can kind of visualize what it looked like. If you can't find your specific city, you just zoom out to the state. But I guarantee that there's an entry from pretty much all over the United States. That actually was part of the plan in defining it as a disaster, is that they sent people all over to take pictures to show that it was happening everywhere. And we can see from the map that they were successful in showing that the Great Depression was affecting everywhere throughout the country. All right. The last thing to consider when discussing FDR's recasting of the Great Depression as a disaster in need of federal intervention is what it does to the future of disaster relief perspectives and policy past 1930. So what happens after? In many ways, Americans see the results of this through the mobilization of resources in response to World War II as a crisis, which could be its own lecture in this seminar that we're not going into tonight. But I think the most significant result is what happens after World War II with the adoption of what becomes known as the Disaster Relief Act of 1950. The Disaster Relief Act of 1950 firmly establishes a new era of federal disaster relief and management, not as an intervention after the fact, so after a disaster occurs, but in efforts to prevent future incidents, so to be really proactive about it. The Act in particular gives the authority to designate incidents of national emergencies or disasters to the President. Under this act, the president can determine what constitutes a national emergency or disaster and issue federal funding to state and local governments for the purpose of disaster relief. Before this act, it took an act of Congress to issue federal funding to disaster-affected areas. Similarly, Congress controlled the spending allocated to each disaster. With this act, the president would have a designated amount of funding to allocate each year to disasters that he saw fit, which could be extended with a request to Congress to allocate more funding if they ran out. This act was supplemented with what's known as the Defense Production Act and the Federal Civil Defense Act. Both have came out in 1950, so we are very much thinking about disaster, defense, and civil defense at the exact same moment, so 1950. All of these acts provided additional designations and avenues for assisting in disaster preparedness and response, so they're all connected in many different ways. If we see the Disaster Relief Act of 1950 within the context of this post-World War II entering into the Cold War era, and based on experiences with a national emergency, a world war, and a disastrous depression, it is easy to see where the act originated and why it would forever change how disaster declaration and federal relief would extend. However, we can also see this as marking a new era of disaster awareness and interest, both from citizens, local governments, and the federal government. This new era would be tested considerably as concerns over the environment and hazards faced from it in the 1960s and 70s came into focus. The final thing I want to say about the Disaster Relief Act is that we really do need to consider it an extension of what you would call maybe a trial period with that Great Depression, and building off of previous discussions over what constitutes a disaster and how the government should respond. So that includes your federal government, it includes your local and your state government, and thus we really need to see it as an extension of that Great Depression period. So in many ways, when we view the Great Depression as a disaster, we view it as something that is one of those turning points in history where we see stuff shift in terms of how we define it and then also how we respond to it. Okay.
So we've got about 20 minutes, Liz.
Okay, 20 minutes left. All right. So going through a little bit more quickly, because now we've kind of moved past this point where we have a very clear definition of what a disaster might be. We know that the president can declare federal funding and declare it a disaster. We reach a new era in history where we are very much in the moment thinking about what constitutes a disaster and looking for them. The era that will follow this 1950 time period is what's often referred to as the civil defense era. In many ways, we are focused on disaster in all different ways. We have the development of the Federal Civil Defense Administration that's going to put out pamphlets and programming and videos about how to respond to different types of disasters, particularly atomic disasters, because that's the thing that's most on our minds. This stems off into every aspect of life, from building bomb shelters to talking with our kids about different sorts of things that they should be scared of, to coming up with those slogans that you used before. So my favorite to show them is that Bert the Turtle, the Duck and Cover, because it kind of sums up a new period where we're coming up with slogans to teach people how to do that. This era will really be capped off, you could say, by the publication of a new book, which will bring new types of disasters into focus, and that's going to be Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Let me see if I can get it. There we go. So Silent Spring, as many of you know who teach it, dealt with this idea that we were reaching a period where we were starting to influence the environment in a way that would then influence us. So in many ways, we are creating our own disasters. This is expressed through things like smog, through rivers on fire. So the Cuyahoga River in Ohio is a good example, through exposure to harmful chemicals like DDT. Rachel Carson will argue in particular that this exposure to different chemicals in our water and our air was killing nature around us, and that if we were to go to the spring, we would find it silent in the future. As a result of Rachel Carson's book, we start to see an awareness about different things affecting us in our world come into focus, and it's going to be really kicked off when we get to the Santa Barbara oil spill in 1969. So this is off Santa Barbara, California. This oil spill really proved that humans were very much affecting their world, in addition to everything else that was seen in the everyday. As a result of the 1969 Santa Barbara oil spill and kind of this buildup in environmental awareness, we are going to see the creation of the very first Earth Day in 1970. So it would have been April 22nd, 1970. This took place on campuses across the United States, so colleges and universities, primary and secondary schools, and in communities as well. And the entire slogan for it was that we had met the enemy and he is us, which kind of speaks to this era of civil defense as well. The environmental movement, as it will develop past 1970s, will incorporate an entire decade of trying to look at our impact on nature and nature's impact on us, so this natural world, and preventing future catastrophes from occurring. A lot of the rhetoric used to describe the effect on the environment and the environment's effect on us uses that disaster framework. So it's a catastrophe waiting to happen. It's a population time bomb. We have unsafe drinking water. And as a result, we will see a push towards using legislation as a way to start to regulate our influence on nature. So when we look at policies that come from the Great Depression, we see the Clean Air Act, water pollution, endangered species, all of these addressing crises that were defined as disasters either waiting to happen or already happening. For classroom activities for the environmental movement, we can see a connection between recent disasters and the environmental movement, such as a discussion of water crises then and water crises now. So particularly the Flint water crisis might be something you could bring up. A review of civil defense preparedness, so what sort of slogans are still around, and then how do we use them, and how does it compare to what we used in the past? These are all things that you can do with your classes. Ultimately, the environmental movement will result in those policies we talked about before, but they'll also result in massive change to our definition of disaster. And here's where we pick up again on that disaster thread. We are going to see another revision of that Disaster Relief Act of 1950 come into play with the revision, which will be the Disaster Relief Act of 1974, which expanded the definition, the funding provided to the president, and the creation of what's known as the National Emergencies Act of 1976. Past that point, we'll see the establishment of a federal emergency management agency, so that's FEMA, in 1978 by the end of the decade, which their entire focus is preventing and responding to disasters. And they lump together about 100 different agencies into this one overarching agency in 1978. And later, we will see the creation of what's known as the 1988 Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act. This act replaces that 1950 Disaster Relief Act and that National Emergencies Act, as well as the Disaster Relief Act of 1974. So it basically covers disasters and emergencies, all of them together as one. It was the most comprehensive revision, you could say, of a Disaster Relief Act since that 1950 Act. And it's built off of multiple disasters that will occur and emergencies. So I'm thinking of like the 3 Mile Island nuclear disaster here is going to be part of that rhetoric. Hurricanes that come after the 70 marker will be part of that as well. So it's really all encompassing. The big thing about the Stafford Act to note is that it also covers the relief. So it's about the disaster itself and the relief and funding both at the same time. And so past 1988, we get a new definition of disaster that incorporates them both. So the before and the after, in addition to the doing.
Liz, I'd like to ask you a quick question.
Yeah.
At what point in your work, in your interpretation of this, do disasters which are inherently democratic, right? When the storms hit, when the zombies roam, when the fires rage, it really is class blind. It's class agnostic. Everybody gets affected similarly. Although obviously in Katrina, there's places in Tammany that we could start to argue the politics. But when did disasters become political in nature? And of course, I'm also thinking of Puerto Rico as I ask this question. When was that shift between disasters are something that democratically and equally affects all of us to a more political conversation?
From a disaster historian perspective, I don't think they ever have not been political. Right. Because you can tie politics to them at any point. That's what I mean by a disaster is reflecting the time period. How we we decided to respond to it or not respond to it, the debates held in Congress over the response, or the letters sent in asking for money. It can date all the way back. I think in terms of our modern interpretation of a disaster as political, Katrina really does help that along, but we do see disasters coming out of the 70s, in particular, so the 3 Mile Island disaster, even the Santa Barbara oil spill can be highly politicized as part of that. So, and we could date it back to the Great Depression here too. So, because that is politics, it's FDR's policies coming into play, and he did receive pushback on it, considerable pushback, in terms of adding these things to it. Great. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
Okay. The next, how am I doing on time?
You're doing fine, but okay. Because we have so many folks from Los Angeles, I think this is one to spend some time on.
This one is definitely important to me. One of the things that Disaster Relief Act and then the Stafford Act that follows does is it brings up a question of whether every incident, whether linked to natural hazards or not, is going to qualify as a disaster or an emergency. During the 1990s, with this ever-expanding definition of disaster, as well as this money that's set aside as part of the Stafford Act, coupled with increasing funds for every type of response to disaster, this question over natural disasters receiving, well, not natural hazards cause disasters, so having a natural hazard to it, or man-made incidents really starts to grow. And I think it's typified particularly in one incident, which is the Los Angeles riots of 1992, which I'm sure you can tie to other incidents, and I'll get into that in just a second. The LA riots brought this question into the spotlight. They tested American definitions of disaster because they were an irregular event occurring due to a confluence of events. While it had the makings of a regular disaster, it included a fire and damage in its wake. Its causes became the target of considerable discussion as it progressed, as well as in its conclusion. As we all might remember, the riots and resulting damage to Los Angeles followed the controversial ruling in the Rodney King police brutality and beating case. They were protests that had turned violent and destructive, wreaking havoc to a tune of $1 billion in property damage. 3,767 buildings were destroyed due to the fire, 63 deaths occurred, and over 2,800 injuries. Almost immediately, let me see if I can get it, there we go. Almost immediately, reporters across the country used the rhetoric of disaster to describe the unfolding events. This started with one LA news station's use of the emergency broadcast system warning to warn people about the riot as it was progressing on television, and it continued throughout the course of the riot and fire following, as well as through investigations, arrests, and cleanup efforts that succeeded these events. During the event, some notable celebrities and TV personalities went on air to proclaim that this was not a normal disaster, nor should we consider it a disaster. This was a people-caused event, and they should stop destroying their community, I believe is what somebody had said to that extent. Meanwhile, others rationalized the disaster as a culmination of events. It was poverty rates, racial tension, increasing incarceration rates, and unemployment that all blended together to create this event. By the fourth day of the riot, President George H.W. Bush had signed a presidential disaster declaration, and you can see it here. It says California fire during a period of civil unrest, and it's got a number to it, which is what FEMA does, is it attaches a number to every single disaster declared by the president. The disaster request, or the declaration of a disaster, was requested by the California governor to the president, and the president did sign it on that fourth day of the riot. It opened up federal funding and assistance through the Stafford Act to provide relief to stabilize the community and funding to recover and rebuild after it. The granting of this declaration was met with mixed reactions connected to the perception of this event. When I'm teaching the LA riots, I always recommend doing an activity that is called, Is This a Disaster? Where I link students up with the FEMA database of presidential disaster declarations since 1950. I have them analyze the incidents of certain types, years, or geographic locations, and also consider which types of disasters are caused by anthropogenic or human factors or natural hazards. Looking up an incident provides them with this opportunity to see which disasters receive the most attention and why certain disasters were declared disasters. It also gives them the opportunity to see which disasters are abnormal amongst a period. If you look through the database, you'll find several examples of irregular disasters, including the inauguration of President Barack Obama as considered a presidential disaster due to the cleanup that was involved in DC. The 9/11 events make it in there, and even which disasters were declared by multiple states or affecting multiple states. Hurricane Katrina, for instance, was declared a disaster by all 50 states, or in all 50 states, meaning that every state either took in refugees from Katrina or felt some sort of economic or physical effect from it. Unfortunately, as you can see on the screen, the FEMA database is inaccessible due to our current government shutdown, but hopefully that will pass and you will be able to use it soon. But it's a massive database that dates back to 1950 and it goes through the present. So you can really search through any different type of disaster, any year, any state in particular, and it is quite fascinating. The other activity that I use in the classroom is to review the impact of the LA riots in context with other sorts of historical riots and within the time period. So I examined the Watts riots, the Zoot Suit riots, the 2015 Baltimore protests, and the 2014 Ferguson riots, among others, to unpack how we describe and define different riots. So when I give them newspaper articles on these, I have them focus in again on the language used to describe the riot. Do they use the phrase protest, civil disorder, race riot, or even riot? How do they describe who is affected by it and what sort of cleanup should be done by it? All of these come into play when talking about the LA riot. And then I also link it to other incidents that were taking place in the 90s in our discussion of disaster and what defines it. Hurricane Andrew will hit a little bit later on that year. And Andy, you had mentioned that earlier tonight. The Chicago heat wave in 1995 will really put a wrench in this discussion of a disaster because it was about people's electricity being turned off and a heat wave striking and killing, I think it was something like 400 people as a result of this heat wave. Both of these, or all three of these incidents, so Hurricane Andrew and the LA riots, and then the Chicago heat wave, will affect the perception of presidential response to different disasters. For the first two, it will impact the 1992 election, as this question over who runs federal relief funding will really be brought up as part of the discussion. In the 1995 period, it will affect President Bill Clinton's administration as they sought to restructure FEMA, in particular appointing Director James Lee Witt and making some massive changes to it that had not been made since its founding in 1979. Overall, the LA riots are a really unique teaching moment for disaster history because it really puts our discussion of this kind of progress of, oh, we're expanding our definition of disaster in question, both in terms of how we reacted to it and described it. And as a result, it's going to influence how we see riot in the future. So Baltimore and Ferguson being the most recent examples that I use in my classes. So I hope that was helpful to the California teachers in particular.
So we have just a couple more minutes. I do want you to talk about Katrina, and I've got sort of a summary question I'd like to ask you as well in terms of Katrina. So I might ask you to truncate this a little bit, but tell us some about this fifth case study.
All right, our fifth case study, and I'm going to do this really fast, is Hurricane Katrina. Katrina is a complex disaster in many different ways. It is a combination of multiple different types of disasters. So we have a hurricane at first in August, we have a flood that's followed, we have another hurricane in September and another one in October. So Rita is the September one, and then Wilma hit Florida is the third one. What it means is that this disaster came to represent multiple things. It was an environmental disaster and it was a social disaster. In terms of disaster planning and response, we had all of the mechanisms in place to respond, and we should have been able to do it. We had a 1988 Stafford Relief Act in place. We have FEMA in place, and New Orleans is very familiar to hurricanes. This disaster swept us off our feet because it was unexpected, and we were unprepared in many ways for it. So while we had response mechanisms in place to have shelters within the cities, shelters were not evacuated soon enough. People sat there for a week. The levee breaks in the city drowned 80% of New Orleans. And as a result, it cuts off the ability to get to different people at different locations to evacuate. When we look at the policy following Katrina, we can really see how much this storm affected our perception of disaster and our desire to change how we responded to it. The Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act was a broad sweeping reform of everything that deals with disaster. We also have new policies that come into play, such as the revised Stafford Act, which will come post-Superstorm Sandy, but after the experience with that, in addition to Katrina. And my favorite to talk about with students is the Pets Evacuation and Transport Act of 2006, which was a write-in campaign. People wrote letters requesting that pets be allowed to evacuate to evacuation sites and shelters, because many people will not leave without their pets. And in fact, we found that out during Katrina. So that's something that really resonates with students because it's something that comes up now regularly in disaster studies, or as we talk about it. Katrina is also influential, and the reason why you should teach it is because it changes our perception of the media's response to different incidents. And it really points out just how much 24-hour news feeds into this cycle and discussion of disaster. And one example that I give here is a discussion of how we define taking resources after a disaster. So in the upper image of that Associated Press, you see that African-American woman there who is described as looting after a grocery store, out of a grocery store. Meanwhile, the bottom image, it's finding bread and soda, two very different impressions. We can apply this for those that are in Los Angeles to that discussion of riot as well. Looting is a very complicated subject in that it is a definition that we imply, and there are lots of reasons that it happens, but this is another reason why we can point out the language of disaster and why it matters. If you're going to do activities in class related to Katrina, the two that I recommend, the first one is an oral history project, to have them do an oral history on a disaster that they have experienced and to record it as part of a database. You can look at the Hurricane Digital Memory Bank created by University of New Orleans for an example of what this may look like. This allows them to document the history that maybe they've experienced or their parents have experienced, and to link it to the experiences of Katrina. And you can look at some examples of those oral histories in the sources. The other thing I recommend is a review of Katrina's impact, particularly looking at the newspaper coverage and the cartoons that came out of describing what this disaster was about. So as you see here, Katrina is depicted as a woman who is striking a voodoo doll in this image. There are others that deal with all sorts of themes that you can bring in to talk about. And I think I attached the cartoons that I have used in classrooms as part of your source material. Overall, when we look at the impact of Katrina, we look at it as representing all of our fears about disasters. It's environmental and cultural, as I said. It was both predictable and unpredictable from a risk and hazards perspective, and it represents everything about American disaster history that we've been discussing tonight. To sum up very briefly, to label something a disaster is historically a way of emphasizing its uniqueness as well as tying it to previous disaster histories. Disasters evoke certain impressions or imagery and thus merit specific responses. There are expectations when it comes to how we respond to disaster that have been refined, especially within the last 100 years. We now expect our government to intervene or assist in response. We expect sympathy or support for the victims, and we anticipate that we will be able to prepare for the next big one. But as with all disaster history, how we define disaster is continually evolving. Most recently, and to bring it all around, there's been considerable discussion over whether a government shutdown could be declared a national emergency by President Donald Trump. What this would allow is the president to utilize that funding for disaster and emergency relief to stabilize or protect from hazards that he sees fit. This could be reopening the government as stabilizing the pay of federal workers or enacting a physical barrier to assist in what he would define as the protection of the country. While the merits of whether the president should or should not do this can be made for both sides of the argument, the fact of the matter is that he does have the right to do this based on our disaster history. This right was developed through American experience with disaster relief and emergency situations and out of what you would consider non-traditional circumstances. It was formalized in an era of nuclear concern and revised as Americans sought to expand their definition of emergency and disastrous situations. And it is regulated by pressure from public participation in the calls for or against action related to what we determine and what we define as a disaster or not. To consider whether this incident should be declared an emergency or not, we need to consider the question asked at every juncture in American history: is this a disaster and or an emergency? And what are the long-term impacts of describing this as such in terms of establishing a precedent for doing so? As we have discussed, this moment, we should reflect on how these things come into play in terms of our understanding of it as a disaster, both caused by natural hazards and not, a reflection of the time period, a definition of trial and error, and in the rhetoric to try and describe it as such. I hope that in listening to this, and I apologize it was so long, guys, I get really excited about it. I hope that in listening to this, that you take away from this experience that disasters influence your life and that it is essential to talk about them. Our students will experience it, you will experience it, and if you don't talk about it, you are not prepared. I think that's the number one thing we can take away from disaster history. In looking at how we've debated what they are, we can see who we define ourselves to be at this particular moment. I encourage you to stay in touch at all of these different ways, and tweet at me if you're using the sources. I hope that you do.
Liz, that's a fantastic place to end. I very much appreciate your perspectives tonight. And in particular, I wanted to underscore the ways in which the humanities can help us make sense of this world. It can help us clarify the ways that we respond to the world around us. And I'm inferring, and I think you very explicitly said that, the students that we work with, whether they're K-12 age students or the students who come to you at Louisiana Lafayette, they are experiencing this in their lives, and being able to understand this rhetoric and understand these concepts is a critical part of preparing them for citizenry. Thank you, Liz.
No, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and it was so cool to see your comments going along the side. So thank you.
I want to also thank all of you for spending your evening with us. I think Liz's offer was not idle. If you have any future thoughts or questions, feel free to contact her via Twitter, through her email, through her website. Also keep an eye on our National Humanities Center social media, our Facebook feed, our Twitter feed, and our YouTube channel. all have regular updates about the work that we do, and we'll keep you connected to the community of both educators and scholars that we work with. Tonight's session has been recorded, and we will have it uploaded and put on our YouTube channel probably within a day or two. I'd also like to remind you that when I close the room tonight, you'll be prompted to do a survey. That survey will then give you your certificate. I think I'm finding that that survey prompt will not come until I actually close the room. So I'm going to wait just a moment or so when I'm finished and saying goodnight. I'll let you guys sort of gather your stuff and get ready to leave the room. I'll close the room, and then you'll get that survey prompt. I hope to see all of you at our next webinar for the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Next Tuesday, January the 29th, we'll be working with Bill Carbone, who's the Vice President of Education at the Rock and Roll Forever Foundation. And his session is titled Rock, Pop, and Hip Hop Are in Fact Humanities. Please have a great day at school tomorrow. I hope to see you again soon in the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Good night.